Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is Mahmoud Abbas, the President of the Palestinian Authority. Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Mr. Abbas, France and the Europeans, have they promised to recognize a Palestinian state?
We couldn't say that these organizations have promised this, but all of the signs on the part of these organizations and governments demonstrate that they are expecting the right moment. They're waiting for the right moment to recognize Palestine. That's why, and you'll have noticed this, that a certain number of European governments have raised the level of their representation of the Palestinian state to the level of a general delegation, to an embassy or to an envoy status. And our envoys are treated as ambassadors are treated. So they're waiting for the right moment. And we as well are waiting. So these governments are waiting for the right moment to declare their support for the Palestinian state. On their end, they're not hesitant, and we would prefer that this happen through negotiations. That's why we wish to come back to the negotiating table at whatever cost in order to reach peace.
The Palestinian Authority has undertaken diplomatic initiatives to obtain the recognition of all states by September. What will be the attitude of the United States? Do you think that the United States are prepared to recognize a Palestinian state in the autumn?
I think that this question is linked to what's going to be happening in September. But let me make this point. President Obama, last September, in his speech to the General Assembly at the UN, had said that he wanted to see a Palestinian state as a full member of the UN in the General Assembly. And that is a very clear sign that the US is ready to recognize that state, an independent Palestinian state. Add to this the fact that the U.S. is still talking about two states. In Bush's and Obama's speech, you hear they refer to two states, and you see this in the roadmap as well. They talk about creating a Palestinian state that would live side by side with the Israeli state. So we have a lot of signs on this principle, and a lot of clues from the U.S. is ready to recognize a Palestinian state. And if they didn't recognize the Palestinian state, then it would not be consistent or logical. It would be contrary to their international policy.
On the one hand, there are the speeches, as you've just said, but then there are acts. In February, the United States vetoed a UN resolution by the Security Council of the UN against the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and some interpreted this as a negative sign.
It may be a sign, but we know quite well that the U.S. used their veto for a question of minor importance. When we spoke to the Security Council, we did so after the U.S. had failed in convincing Netanyahu to prolong the suspension of the settlements, the extension of the settlements. And we added a paragraph compliant to what Mrs. Clinton said, that the settlements were illegal. Despite this, the U.S. used their veto. But we have gone beyond that, because we feel that we should not create problems with the U.S. for this question only. We've entered into dialogue with them again by discussing horizons for negotiation.
But if next September the United States clearly oppose the recognition that you are looking for here in France and elsewhere, what will you do?
An international opposition with the United States, if they're told that they should not recognize a Palestinian state, then we will come back to our country, we'll get together the Palestinian leaders, and we'll explain all of the options to them so that we can decide together what to do next. And if you ask the question, frankly, I don't know what the response will be. It will be a difficult and perhaps dangerous step. I don't know. But we don't have any other response. That's my response.
It could be the third intifada, for example.
This would certainly not be my preference, a third armed intifada, though. This is not I don't want that to happen. And I have committed, as the president of the Palestinian Authority, not to allow a third intifada. But passive resistance on the part of the people is certainly an option. And we see this every day in all of the villages in Palestine, with the Palestinians, Europeans, and even Israelis. And this is something that's very positive. As to the armed intifada, this is not in our program.
You have talked about the Israelis. Benjamin Netanyahu is also talking about a Palestinian state, and there have been discussions with the Israelis. Do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu is a solid partner for peace?
Whether we consider him a partner or not is not really something we've thought about. But he is the Prime Minister of Israel. He's an elected Prime Minister. So we dialogue with him on that basis. As to the Israelis and the Israeli people, more generally, all of the surveys demonstrate that 75% of Israelis support peace. I met with the Jewish communities throughout the world, specifically in France, in the US, in Brazil, in Canada, everywhere. And I met many Israelis in Ramallah, various officers, party representatives, and very regularly I meet with Israeli journalists. And the Israeli journalists and the Israeli people and the officers and others believe in peace. As to Netanyahu, when I met with him in September at Washington, after the invitation of the US, with respect to settlements, we went to Washington and we did not find that Mr. Netanyahu was ready. We had a dialogue with him at Sharm el-Sheikh. We weren't able to agree with him on stopping the settlements. We couldn't even decide on the agenda to start talking about borders and so forth. They always said we have to start by talking about security, which is not logical.
So today the negotiations with the Israelis are at a standstill, are they?
There are no ongoing relations with the Israelis right now, because negotiations have to take place on a clear basis. On the tripartite quartet release. In Great Britain, France, and Germany. But none of that has happened. Between the Israelis and us, there's only one thing. There is a coordination amongst us with respect to security. This is still in place, but there are no other relationships than that.
I would like to discuss the situation in Gaza. An Italian activist was assassinated, and the Salafist jihadist groups are suspected. Is there a danger in Gaza of small Salafist jihadist groups settling in Palestine and in other parts of Palestine?
I think in Gaza, some of these groups have come into being extremist groups, have come in around Hamas, but not directly from Hamas. They are perhaps dissidents as well, or perhaps they came from the outside with their own extremist ideas. These are individuals that assassinated this Italian, who came to support the Palestinian cause, to serve the interests of the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, he was rewarded with death, which is inhuman, and we vigorously condemned. this action in every possible way, and as did the Hamas. They also condemned this cowardly act. They said that they've actually surrounded them and killed 2 individuals from this extremist group, and they captured 2 others. They are extremists, and apparently they are the ones that committed this odious act, which is not in keeping with Palestinian customs.
One last question. Reconciliation with Hamas, is it a real possibility or not?
To not go backwards and talk about details in the past and the efforts with the Egyptians to put together a reconciliation document, all of these efforts have not reached a final conclusion. 1 month I made a suggestion. I suggested that I go to Gaza and to get together to form a technocratic government that would be independent, and they could determine a date for presidential and legislative elections. That initiative was welcomed greatly by the whole world. The UN, the European Union, the non-aligned countries, the Islamic Conference, Russia, Turkey. Only Hamas has not responded yet officially. They haven't said yes or no. We're still waiting for their answer. And we are trying to demonstrate that this initiative is the only way of moving forward, especially in the agreement on the elections, and then the resolution of all of the pending questions. We need to reunify our country, because as Palestinians, we cannot declare an independent state if we're still divided.
Very good, Mahmoud Abbas. Thank you very much for having been our guest on the France 24 interview, and thanks to our viewers for watching the interview.
Thank you.